Ladies and gentlemen, my fellow feathers in arms, welcome to the premiere episode of The Rabbit Holes That Quack. You're mostly related to today's documentary, Fake Famous Podcast. I am one of your hosts, Brandon Jones, and joining me downstream on this adventure, the woman, the myth, a quack who wants to be Instagram famous, Miss Nicole Matthews.
Hello, listeners.
And if you are just joining us well into the future or in near real time, welcome. This is a podcast where Nicole and I subject ourselves to a random documentary every week and let that be the springboard for a larger conversation about the issues therein. If you'd like to drop a particular documentary into the hat for us to choose from, we'll be choosing them from amongst our patrons at patreon.com/PandorasQuack, where you can also submit broader topics, comments, and questions for both this and our other sister podcast, such as The Movies That Quack, where co-host Wade Slicken and I put each other on the spot each week to ask each other Hollywood's most poignant and stupid questions about what we think will happen next, as well as The Conversations That Quack, where co-host Efrain Garcia and I do a weekly deep dive into the issues facing the Black movie protagonist. If you enjoy what you hear tonight, help us keep it going by supporting us over at patreon.com/PandorasQuack and becoming a Patreon of any one of our tiers that start as low as $1, which includes early access to all of Pandora's Quack's podcast. But if that's not in the cards for you right now, that's more than okay. Feel free to share, rate, and review us on the free podcasting service of your choice, and stick around for Pandora's Quack's other upcoming shows. And so, listeners, without further ado, these are the rabbit holes that quack. Fake Famous is a documentary that follows an actress, fashion designer, and real estate assistant who attempts to become social media influencers by purchasing fake followers and bots to boost their popularity. It was written and directed by Nick Bilton, for whom this is his first documentary. I believe he was a former New York Times writer, now contributes to Vanity Fair or Variety. I want to say it's Vanity Fair. Might have that mixed up.
I used to have to pitch him, actually, when he was at the Times. He never wrote back.
And as of this recording, Fake Famous currently sits at 73% for critical Rotten Tomatoes rating with a 66% audience score. So I want to kick off this episode here with you, Nicole, by asking you very simply to define for me and the listeners what your definition of famous is.
Oof. See, that's going to be probably not what you would expect me to say, because for me personally, that was one of the things that I think this documentary highlighted that most people have a misconception about. And I can't remember the woman's name that they brought in to talk about this, but she did go into, I would say, a good amount of time just about the difference between actually being famous and what we now consider to be maybe, let's say, influencer famous.
Yeah.
So for me personally, my definition of fame is the traditional old school, like, let's say Brad Pitt, Angelina Jolie style. That to me is fame. Someone the entire world, you could go to lots of different countries, even developed countries, and people might have knowledge of who that person is. Audrey Hepburn in her day probably would have been someone that met that definition as well. So yeah, you'd have to be almost, globally known and recognized both by name and by face.
See, it's interesting that you went the celebrity route, because I was thinking about that earlier myself, and I was just like, all right, if someone was just famous, quote unquote, you're, it's kind of like your, listeners were both in the New York area. We walk down the street and you see someone being flocked to by just a crowd of whoever. And I might, or, someone goes, oh, who is that? Well, what are they famous for? Kind of thing. So I kind of took more of that sort of approach, where I just said someone basically who is known for something positive or negative. It might be you're the pizza guy. It might be, oh, you're the person who was able to do that keg stand for 22 seconds. Or you just might be the person who solved the Rubik's Cube while also driving a stick shift, kind of thing. I do agree with you that it kind of like also scales to that definition that you just gave of, being someone who's like globally recognized, sort of almost like an institution or a franchise. But I think like for me, it's just like, oh, you're the guy or the gal that's like known for like that thing. as stupid as that is, or as like, as I was saying before, just the scale of it may be quite big, which is interesting.
I agree that my definition can expand to meet your definition. So I think we're more or less aligned. I use celebrities as an example because I do think more often than not in our society, those are the people that tend to be the most famous. That's actually what's interesting, right? Is like we don't have a lot of other examples of people that achieve fame for other things. I mean, there's athletics, and there's politics as well. And then sometimes there's those fluke incidents, you know.
Yeah.
But I would say most of our athletes and our politicians do reach celebrity status in reality, because that's, you know, it's essentially what our culture prizes. Hence kind of this documentary. But yeah.
Yeah, and I imagine we'll get into it, but I almost think almost less than, like I think like our definitions are definitely sort of both ends of the spectrum and then kind of including everything in between. What I would say though is that talent, whether you're a musician or an athlete, which is kind of usually the go-to, maybe sort of an actor, actress kind of thing, I think that gives you that long tail of fame. Whereas I think if you're just sort of everything from, you know, the hero of the week, of, you know, the person who, you know, saves someone from choking at like a diner, and then they kind of get their, you know, talk show rounds. No one kind of remembers who that was, sort of thing, after a while. But to exactly your point, there's like Brad Pitt, and even if he stopped acting now and lived for another 40 years, everyone would be like, oh, I still remember Brad Pitt, kind of thing. It's kind of like almost like the Tom Cruise phenomenon, where it's like he's probably the last movie star, like actual movie star, that people kind of, his name goes above the billing, that is just completely well known kind of globally, and probably is still used to leverage to open movies. So the next thing I want to kind of bring us to, as we, you know, approach diving into the documentary, one more sort of preliminary question for you. I just wanted to get your general thoughts on just influencer culture in general. It's something that's come up kind of recently, sort of in my circles, both professionally and sort of personally. So before we kind of dive into sort of what the subject matter of the documentary, kind of how it was presented, just wanted to try to get your almost, maybe if at all possible, for you to almost forget that you had seen the documentary, and just sort of like, what were your thoughts on influencer culture before all this?
Yeah, I think, you know, for me, I think I had always understood the rise of it really well, you know, because I think there was a lot of things just contributing, you know, just kind of being of the generation that was like, you know, the first years of Facebook and things like that, right? I think that you kind of see where things are heading as these platforms have progressed. So as influencer culture popped up, I don't think I was surprised by it. And I think the more attractive side of it to me from the beginning was, I think, the amplification of self-expression. And I think that was always very interesting to me. But then I think I was also very aware as well of sort of people around me, I think, that were being influenced by things at their own detriment, and finding that really odd to watch. Like people that were actually buying, you know, like these fit teas, and like various diet products, and, you know, all of the terrible, terrible things that get sold to women online. And just sort of finding that really bizarre, and also kind of, you know, even in the early days, drawing this line between the types of influencers that did that and the types of influencers that didn't do those types of endorsements, but how sometimes you would be surprised, you know, that more or less everyone did. Some were just a little bit better at hiding it, I think, or developing a larger brand where that wasn't sort of the initial perception, you know, but there's definitely ones out there that just do nothing but, you know, but hawk shit. So yeah, I guess top line, kind of a mixed sort of attraction to certain elements of it, but also a consciousness of the negatives.
Yeah, I almost look at it as two categories, kind of along maybe three categories. So like one being you are creator. So it could be anything from you are photographers, so you're just kind of posting the types of things that you shoot, and then people kind of understand it. And maybe if you have a layer of interaction, it's you saying, this is the camera I use, this is the equipment I use, this is where I went, this is how I shot it, like that kind of thing. I think there's sort of what you were just getting at, where there's the sort of celebrity culture where it's kind of a, whether they mean to or not, there's this sort of selling of the lifestyle where it's like, oh, I see you, celebrity, who probably is known for something, one of the categories we talked about previously, like athlete or musician or something of that nature. And it's kind of like, oh, I see the life that you're living. I aspire to have those things. And so I am kind of willing to follow you along on your journey, both silly and serious, to kind of understand perhaps how you got there. But then I think there's this sort of third category that'll kind of transition us into sort of, you know, Nick Bilton sort of onus for this documentary, where it's sort of you're famous for being famous, you're influential for being influential, and what exactly does that mean? So exactly kind of to your point, where it's kind of like there's, oh, I'm watching someone who very clearly knows their way around a camera or a kitchen or music, and I'm kind of learning, educating myself through their lens, kind of through their recommendations, their advice, and sort of their skills and sort of their talent. But then you have this sort of other category where it's unclear kind of what they're doing that is quote unquote, don't know exactly what the word or phrase I'm looking for, but I guess meaningful is kind of what we'll say. And it's not that every post or every sort of influencer has to have that, but it's almost like, what is your actual value? And both,
what's making them worth their influence?
Exactly. And like you and I both, are, connected to sort of the advertising sort of marketing industries. And so when we sort of look at that, I've always kind of had this trepidation for influencers, because whereas I do think that they are capable of, from an awareness kind of tactics sort of standpoint, kind of getting the word out there, kind of spreading, hey, this is something, with all the YouTube ads that I get served of, hey, here's XYZ product and you should sort of like use it, those kind of things. It just kind of, there was this like gold rush kind of thing for them, I think, like probably 10 years or so ago, where everyone was just sort of like throwing money at influencers because of sort of their follower counts, and everyone just sort of assuming that, oh, if that person has 1 million followers, that's 1 million sets of eyeballs that will probably buy our product, sort of thing. And I think the issue that I always had, kind of coming up more on the professional side of social media than sort of the personal side, was I never really saw the business, call it, benefit kind of it. Like I saw kind of like from a brand affinity and from sort of a standpoint of, oh, like that person's audience, it's an introduction, there's sort of this feel good sort of nature. But then when you start to see the amount of money that was kind of going towards influencers' way, or sort of the amount of free products or the, the free trips and sort of things, I was just always curious about what exactly businesses felt they were getting in return, and if any of them had sort of buyer's remorse about spending 6 figures for a post or something like that. Like I forgot what the Kim Kardashian thing was. I think it was like, I don't know if it was in this or something else that I'd read, where it was like, it's like almost like $1 million or something like that for her to just post something. And it's kind of like, when you do that, is that, as from a business, does that feel on par with a Super Bowl ad, or on par with, during the season finale of this show, or during an award show or something like that? Like, do they feel like is that worth it to them? So that's why
for me, I think that also depends greatly though on the type of business, because I would argue for certain types of businesses, those doing influencer marketing, I think, can be very effective. Like for example, let's say you're a restaurant, right? That foot traffic usually doesn't go away right away. Like if you, especially depending on the influencer, right? And depending on the city, like if it's a city like New York or Miami, where, people are very conscious of where they're eating out, and it is a status thing. I mean, Miami, especially, it's status where you're going to eat, who can get the hot table for the night, right? Like if you can get the right influencer in and then cement your establishment as a place that people want to go to, I think that does have lasting effects. And I think you know this well, because I've dragged you to many of those types of events and restaurants and places and things like that, that I have seen probably either from an influencer or somewhere on Instagram.
I will definitely give you the local level influence of that. I actually would agree with you completely that I would be less inclined to go stay at a hotel because of an influencer, but I would be more inclined to be like, oh, apparently this breakfast place or this coffee place that is in blah, blah, blah. Apparently you have to wait like 25 minutes in order to get an espresso, but apparently it's the greatest espresso of all time. And then you go and you have it and you're like, okay, maybe that was expensive, but that was actually worth it. That to a certain degree, I agree with you. Like that business will benefit greatly from getting that sort of kick-started word of mouth kind of thing. I think where it falls apart for me is when you have like a car company or, you know, as I just said, something in the hospitality industry or something like that, where it almost has nothing to do with the influencer, because at that point it's like, do I really want to spend all this money? It's kind of like the bottom line. Like, it's like, do I really want to spend all this money to go on this trip? Like, that's a harder sell than like, oh, I was going to go get coffee anyway. And apparently like these people that I follow say that this is the best. But that's when you start getting to that layer, the kind of the layer that I'm talking about, that's just like peer-to-peer recommendation. I don't even know that that's like an influencer. That's like if you just told me, oh, hey, like I stopped by, walked down this random street that I never go down and discover this coffee shop. That's almost like as powerful to me as then, or more powerful to me than seeing someone that I follow online. Kind of say that.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. The hotel example makes me laugh because I earlier today screenshotted a hotel that an influencer was at. And the reason is, I'll probably botch her name, but Chiara Ferragni, I think that's how you say it. She has over, I want to say 23 million followers on Instagram. Amazon recently did a documentary about her that we should watch, actually. She posted, once again, back at my favorite hotel in Lake Como. And I want to go to Lake Como someday. And if I'm going to go, I think I want to go to her favorite hotel. She is an Italian celebrity. And it's just funny that you draw the line at hotels. I was already influenced by one earlier today.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's because when it comes to that stuff, I would rather be the first person there to like discover sort of an uncut gem. Like I would rather, like I've, you know, told you this kind of over the years, where I'm more inclined to, let's just pop into this random bar that's sitting here that no one's going to, and then go in there and then discover, oh, the owner just makes the most ridiculous mojito that you've ever had. You have it and you're just like, oh wow, like maybe the rest of the restaurant is like not up to snuff, maybe the rest of the menu is sort of a little like wonky or whatever, but you have that mojito, and then all of a sudden now you're like, oh, I just had the greatest mojito of all time, and then you put it on the map kind of thing. Like I feel like I would rather go on that adventure and be wrong 99 times, but remember definitively for the rest of my life that one time that we went and got sort of the definitive whatever item that was, or just like, you know, as I said, the weird bed and breakfast, the hotel, the something that was just off the beaten path, than to sort of follow in the footsteps of 500,000 people who saw a post over the course of the last 5-10 years and then just were like, oh, this is the place to go. Because I think like you've probably even kind of experienced this definitely a lot more than I have, where it's like by the time you get there, by the time you get that reservation, by the time you go, it's almost not even what was sort of presented. Like it's like, yes, there was sort of, maybe if it was higher scale or if it was glitzy or the service or blah 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 blah, but it's almost like because everybody now has gone and done it, it's like no longer special. You may not feel that way, but it's kind of like, it feels like, oh, we're just sort of on an assembly line that was kicked off because of an influencer.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think sometimes I feel that way and sometimes I don't, yeah. I think is what I would say. I think certain places, you know, you and I not long ago went to Amalfi, right, in Italy. And I would say that's probably one of the most Instagrammed destinations that you will ever see. I mean, there's pictures of Amalfi all over Instagram. And I kind of did expect to feel a little bit like, okay, like this was, you know, just very like touristy, whatever. And parts of it certainly were, you know, and we talked about that when we were there. But I think overall, I was in love, right? Like to me, it delivered on kind of what people had made it up to be, you know. But I do agree that there's definitely sometimes, I think, where something can become so overhyped or so oversold that the actual experience doesn't live up to what you've made it up to be in your head.
Yeah. So with that as the groundwork laid, let's dive into Nick Bilton's film. Broadly, what did you think just sort of about the documentary sort of as a film? Like, did it seem fair? Did it seem biased? Did it seem like Nick Bilton's point of view you know, gave you something to sort of reflect on or think on with the influencer sort of industry? Or did the film kind of feel like a hit piece? Did the film feel just sort of like, how did you kind of, when the credits rolled on it, what were your thoughts, kind of initial thoughts?
Yeah, I definitely think it made me very reflective, and I think it kind of answered a lot of questions I had for myself, even around how I want to continue to operate on Instagram, I think, like moving forward. So there was like an enlightening side of it. But that being said, I mean, I do think overall it was definitely a very, I would say for the most part, kind of like one-sided point of view on influencer culture. To my recollection, I think there was really like one area where the film really did talk about it in sort of a positive way. And I think that was a section where it highlighted just how Instagram and different social platforms have really been a boon to, you know, activism and bringing awareness to different causes around the world, but also different types of people, marginalized groups, etc. That to me, though, really felt like the only kind of positive that the film took the time to highlight. I do think outside of that, there was a lot more that was kind of gearing us towards a negative view of Instagram and influencer culture more than anything else.
Yeah, actually, to that point, one of the quotes I pulled from BuzzFeed writer Stephanie McNeil from a review, just an excerpt here, where she was saying, Bilton and his team had an opportunity to examine this critically undercovered multi-billion-dollar industry thoughtfully and analytically, showing viewers how the people we follow online shape our culture and perceptions of ourselves. Instead, the documentary mocks influencers for a grueling half an hour, casting an entire ecosystem primarily built and run by women, as one male talking head put it, people who are not employed and without a sense of purpose. It was interesting because when the credits kind of rolled on this, I think from my initial reaction was more, yeah, it feels like just kind of something that is what you make it, both from someone who consumes it and both from the point of view of someone who creates content. Like, it's kind of like if you are going onto Instagram primarily, you actually made me kind of think of if there's even sort of what I would call Facebook influencers. I haven't really been on Facebook in a long, long time, but I would say Instagram first and foremost, and maybe like Twitter is sort of a distant second. But if you go onto something like Instagram and you are very, susceptible to everything you're seeing, that you won't do anything without the express sort of, permission, if you will, as kind of weird as that says, from your influencer, then I can understand why you then would kind of have a point of view that this is just, a sort of a terrible industry. But I think some of the entrepreneurial aspects of it, there were two things in particular that I actually was kind of like, oh, I actually never really thought about that in that lens before. There was the instance where, and we'll kind of dive in sort of each of the three of these sort of the influencers from the documentary in a little bit more detail. But Dominique, sort of the female sort of the group, she goes on this trip, influencer kind of VIP trip, and she's kind of commenting on how these two influencers basically have a spreadsheet and kind of all these types of things, and very, very much keeping tabs on which brands do what, who have they met, and kind of like all that kind of thing. And it's exactly what you would expect if you were just sort of a traveling salesman type of for any industry. And I kind of was like, oh, that's pretty interesting. I was just like, part of me knew that there was definitely a heavy layer of obviously sort of production and all that kind of stuff, but sort of that aspect of it, I just never really kind of sat with. The second thing that and I always remember laughing about it as I was watching, was just the level of potential deception that I just found amusing and even sort of was impressed by when like Nick kind of has Dominique and Wiley over sort of at his house, I think is what it was. And they're just taking all these pictures, and there's this sort of, they're in the like, kiddie pool with like with the roses and such. I was like, it's interesting because it's like, it feels like one of those things where everybody on Instagram knows, kind of with an asterisk, that it's like, oh, so-and-so didn't really go to Italy, or so-and-so didn't really go to that hotel. But then I guess there's enough truth that when the lies or kind of deception are there, no one really kind of calls out or no one really cares. But then that's when you start to kind of think, well, if this is all in some ways a performance and no one is really taking it seriously from a standpoint of, oh, well, you weren't actually there, so you're a liar kind of thing. If this is more like, oh, well, I just want to aspire to be someone who kind of looks like it has the life that you have, then I kind of was like starting to be like, this is interesting. Like I was like, again, I still think I had the preconceived notions of sort of the business aspects and sort of the business tangibility that we were talking about. But then when I was looking at the craft of what some of these influencers do, in particular the fashion ones, in particular the ones that don't really seem to have it's a weird thing to say, but they don't seem to have an actual tangible talent. They just seem to be someone who's kind of living this lifestyle, if that makes sense. That was kind of the piece that I was like, oh, that's interesting. I just wouldn't have thought that much strategy, I guess, goes into it.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I wasn't surprised. I did really appreciate that they showed that and I appreciated even, I think, the way that Dominique was navigating that and also the way that she was talking about it as well. Because I think, she did kind of continue to credit those women with just how much work they were putting into it, how much energy it took, how unglamorous a lot of it was, like those desert pictures where anyone else in the world would see that and assume that it's warm in that photo, but really they're all freezing. I think, for me, just kind of having followed a lot of fashion influencers kind of from the beginning of Instagram, I knew some of that was going on. So for me, it wasn't like a shock, but I think it was really cool that they kind of did provide that point of view for people to see that like these women are running their individual businesses. And I think I think a large part of my awareness around that is some of the influencers I follow that I do more kind of respect because of the way that they approach a lot of their content deals. And I think like a lot of them will actually share like details on how they work with brands and how they go through and select sort of these endorsements. And it does give you a real sense of just kind of, to your point, like how much it is a true business. And especially like in terms of what type of brand you might be trying to put off, then you have to be even more careful. And it is really fascinating. I do appreciate that from at least a handful of influencers I follow, that they give you that transparency to just sort of say like, hey, I do have a process. Like, I don't actually just take things and promote it. This is my process usually. Like, either if I want to work with a brand, I'll reach out and ask for something, then I test it for a certain period of time. Like, there are a lot of women out there that have been really, I think, careful and strategic about how they're going to build a business like this. So that was cool to see for sure. And then I agree with you just about, the deception piece. I think there was a lot of different instances that were quite hilarious throughout the documentary where they showcase that. And I do think it does sort of, really bring into question, this sort of, fake versus reality. And again, like, are we all just sort of constantly being deceived by what we see from, friends and people we follow?
Yeah. I almost wonder, like, does that diminish Instagram at all for you? Because like, I think as someone who is definitely not on it as much as you or kind of as most people, like I usually only get deep links to it when people are like, oh, here's sort of a funny meme or a funny video or something that they were scrolling through. So like when I'm looking at Instagram, and this is probably slightly outdated, but it's just like, I kind of always was like, there are two categories in Instagram. There's my friends that are just posting, hey, I went with my son to the park, or I went with my wife or my daughter, blah, 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 blah. And then there's the other side there. It was kind of always just like, oh, again, that aspirational category of people who are just like, hey, I am at Burning Man and blah, 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 blah. And like just kind of doing these things. And so like, I never really thought much more of it than that. Like I knew that obviously like that's probably the 20-second picture attempt at blah, 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 blah that they took, like all that kind of stuff. Like that's kind of just sort of, that's just, having a camera in our time period, in our timeline. But then when I was kind of looking at this documentary and just kind of really seeing just this over production in order to pretend that, oh, I'm just stumbled into this pool to like have some chocolates and champagne kind of thing. It was kind of just like this weird, like, like, I guess it's really no different than like seeing that in a magazine, but I think in a magazine there was kind of the belief, that that's staged. It's obviously staged. Like, that's someone who's like, the theme that this person is doing as they're giving their interview for this, photo essay is like that they're carefree. And so it's, there's a production, but I think with Instagram, because there's a sort of interchangeability of your actual friends taking actual photos of their actual vacation versus sort of these people who are kind of pretending like they are, and then we all just kind of accept it, sort of thing. I don't know. Like, it's like, does that diminish that at all to you? Or are you just kind of like, yeah, I mean, that's just an average Tuesday for you scrolling Instagram?
No, it's not. And I think that's where it gets into sort of like both the issue of scale and then also quality. I think in terms of scale, one of the things that really struck me in the beginning when they were talking about numbers is just sort of the volume of people around the world that have 1 million followers. Right. Yeah. And just sort of like, I think there was just a scene where they were kind of doing the math on that. Right. Like, yeah, in terms of, just how not famous all these people really are. Right. Because it's mathematically impossible. So I think there's the scale issue for sure, where it's like, I just do follow a lot of people that have a ton of followers, right? And I don't think those people are faking it. Like, again, the Italian woman I mentioned earlier, 23 million followers, like, nothing about her life is fake. She's filthy rich. She's like a princess in Italy. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's just like that to me. I know that, like, yes, even though she's for sure using a lot of those same strategies of maybe posting things a couple days later or stuff like that, it's not actually faked what you're seeing in the photo. So I think there's that. And then I think in terms of the people I follow that are a little bit more, maybe let's say around that 1 million mark or like approaching that 1 million mark, what they are actually showing is things that, again, aren't faked because it's so real what you're seeing, right? So, like, for example, I follow this woman, Brooklyn Blonde. She's a fashion influencer. I think she has maybe let's say 500,000 followers or something like that. I mean, especially even since the pandemic, so much of what she shares is just her family life. It's just videos of her kids. And I watch this every day. And it was funny because her eldest son just turned 5, and she had a post about it. And it was like, just wanted to thank you all so much. I know most of you have been following him and all of my stories about him since he was born. And it made me realize in that moment, like, yeah, I literally have been following this woman and watching her children, and that's all I do. Like, and she has other stuff, and she's influenced me with like beauty products or like the pillow that I sleep on. So there is this peripheral stuff, but her everyday content isn't that. It's content that can't be faked. And I think a lot of the people that I follow fall more in that category than in living these sort of aspirational lifestyles that, like, I know aren't real. Because I live in New York and I understand income and, what is actually possible based on what people do for a living. So yeah, I think it's just more nuanced for me because of who I follow. I call that stuff out, and I think I'm, pretty used to seeing it, but not in my own personal feed.
Then to take it a step further, writer from the New Yorker, Naomi Fry, in her review, she was saying, "This is a confusing business, a confusion I am not exempt from. As a writer who often shares her life and work online, I'm aware of my own tendency to post culturally covetable content to my Instagram and Twitter feeds, and of my greedy desire for the niche social capital that I might imagine it might bring me. While I was watching the film, it was hard for me not to keep opening Instagram on my phone to check how many likes I'd received on my latest post, although I knew full well that no number would ever feel like enough." So even kind of like what you're talking about, it's almost like, yes, that person posting about her kids and all that kind of stuff may, again, feel genuine, but then it almost feels like it's another layer of the matrix, kind of like with this New Yorker writer, where she's kind of like, yeah, I mean, she's posting things that she knows will sort of get likes, will get this engagement, will sort of get all these types of things. So it's like, even everything that you just said and kind of the ability to sort of distinguish what's genuine or not, that's why I kind of scratch my head at like Instagram as a whole, because of the, what I was saying earlier about like, yes, my friend who I see a couple times a week, who I know went on this vacation, I see him taking pictures of him on the beach, and that makes sense. But then this other writer who I believe to be doing these things, this sort of, you know, completely removed, I have no personal sort of relationship with this person. I'm believing and trusting that this is sort of authentic, but then I don't actually know if this is also just a curated, you know, all posts are curated to a certain extent, but is this a curation designed to make me like them, to make me want to buy the things that they go, shop the things that they shop, visit the places that they stay, like that kind of thing. And then it just kind of, you know, you just go further and further and further down that rabbit hole of like, well, then what is real? And then to my earlier point, does it actually even matter then? Is Instagram just like watching a television show, and there just so happens to be people that you know in real life, say on the commercial breaks, but then there are these people who are doing these really high value productions of things, and it's just cool to see.
I mean, I really believe it is a spectrum for sure. Yeah. And it's a very broad spectrum too. You know, I mean, again, like I think there's lots of different types of influencers out there, as they even address in the documentary. You know, you can kind of have them for any sort of big sector that you can think about, right? They exist: food, travel, fashion, etc. So I think it's a tough question to say broad strokes, but I think to your point, I think we do have to assume that a certain level of everything that we're seeing on Instagram is a manipulated form of reality, right? I think that is sort of what everyone is kind of signed up for, and to consume that, and then to do that, you know, for themselves in a lot of instances, right? And I think it's interesting too, that question then of authenticity. And, you know, I think I found Chris to be really interesting in the documentary. I think he was one of the ones that probably had the most different way of thinking about things. He also had one of my favorite quotes of the documentary. I think it was towards the end. He said, "I would rather be broke and real versus rich and fake," which I thought was great. But I think he's probably in the minority on that. You know, I think a lot of people are on Facebook, on Instagram, not necessarily because they want to be rich and fake, but I think, to go back to an early thing in the documentary that I also thought is interesting, people are on Instagram because I think a lot of people really, really like the idea of not having to work for a living. And I think that for me was something I really appreciated that they addressed, because I think it's something I've talked about with friends. It's very prevalent, I think, in a lot of my social circles. I think there is something very appealing, especially given the way that the world is today and some of the darker things that we deal with and some of the harsher realities of this world. It's very enticing to people, this concept of, I'm not going to work. And so I think that's why people are okay to buy into the fake, because it's sort of like, wait, well, if I can master that as well, maybe I can quit my job, right? Like maybe I can spin some of this fake to my advantage. So I think, I think there's a transparency there, but I think we're all kind of collectively ignoring it.
Yeah. I think the thing that was really interesting about Chris's story in particular, I saw a few things that I read kind of call this out, but I felt like, whereas Nick really kind of was bringing Dominique sort of along for this ride, and, you know, Dominique was definitely kind of like, yeah, just tell me whatever I need to do. Like, she's kind of just the sort of archetypical go-getter, or, you know, call it the stereotype of the doe-eyed, you know, I moved here to LA to be famous and I'll kind of do whatever it sort of takes kind of person. So like, it was like this weird thing of like watching her and being like, okay, like you have this sort of attractive, like young girl who's, you know, almost stereotypically trying to be an actress, stereotypically trying to sort of do some modeling. It didn't really seem like, from Nick's thesis, that it was actually going to be difficult for her to like become an influencer. And so like, what I was curious about was Chris and Wiley, and in particular Chris, who's sort of the fashion person, who I felt like the documentary kind of just neglected. And like, what I mean by that is like, they ran Dominique kind of through just sort of exactly what you would probably take her through. Like, it's kind of like, okay, if she were going to become a legit influencer, from her, I think, 1,100 followers and stuff. There's the whole sort of bots sort of piece, which we can get to in a second. But then from a standpoint of like, all right, well, what type of content is this type of girl going to be posting? And then Nick facilitated all of that, you know, with all the photo shoots, and we're going to do this and kind of fake this and this. And he did the same thing with Wiley, with sort of the real estate agent, kind of the assistant person, was kind of like, okay, let's do this. And the thing that I kept sort of waiting for was like, okay, well, you can't really do that with Chris, because Chris doesn't want to pretend like he's at this like high, you know, this hotel. He doesn't want to pretend like he's at whatever. He wants to be sort of a fashion designer. So what are we doing then to see if we can kind of push him with our tools outside of, again, the bots and the whatever, to kind of give him the ability to do that? And I felt like the documentary didn't really try, or, you know, maybe it got cut or whatever. And even when he has that conversation with Nick sort of towards the end, to the part that you're talking about, it was just kind of like, Nick's just kind of like, oh, interesting. We tried to buy you bots and you didn't want the bots. We tried to buy you comments and you didn't want the comments. And it's kind of a funny scene about like what those, you know, the comments being sort of cheesy. And then it just seemed like Nick just kind of like, well, I guess we give up. And it just felt like weird to me. Like, it was like, why, like, where was the sort of tailoring of the, whatever? Like, it's like, if this person, like, for instance, one of the girls who, audition was the roller skating person, I would imagine they would do some fashion stuff with her, but I also would imagine they would like have her roller skating in places where, like, you know, to your earlier point, people would go, oh, I like roller skating, I want to go roller skate there, kind of thing. But if you have this person who creates sort of fashion, where was the, okay, like, we're going to get you taking photos here because, you know, this sort of is representative of whatever, you know, 80s rapper who was doing fashion here. I just felt like they didn't really try to do anything with or for him, and Chris was just kind of doing his own thing the entire documentary.
Yeah, I mean, well, so, okay, they did have him in the gym, and they had him doing, like, the tire lifts and, like, all of that. So I think, like, that was that initial thing. I think they were just like, okay, his thing is more the gym. My read on that was more that he was resisting, because then I think the next thing that we saw him in, after they had the whole gym shoot for him, then we saw him in the, you know, the fake private plane, right? And I think Nick was very clear to say Chris refused to post any of these photos.
Yeah.
Right. So I think more what I would say is I thought that they did make attempts. He had the gym thing. I think that what my critique would be is more, they should have found a way to be more creative to get something he would agree to. Yeah. I think they were trying to do like the same sort of cookie cutter thing across the board, because probably you would know better than me on this. That's probably what production had planned for, right? Yeah. Was like, okay, here are the things we're going to do. And then he wasn't going with it, and they just probably didn't have a plan B, you know? But I think, to your point, it would have been much more interesting if they had attempted a more custom approach for him, just to see if they could have made him an influencer in his own right that he would have felt comfortable with, right? Like, that would have made for a much more interesting story for him within the documentary.
Yeah, because with regards to Dominique, like, she didn't change her behavior, you know? Like, she still was going on auditions, she still was doing everything that she would ordinarily do. But now that she was able to post these, you know, these posts that were like, oh, she goes and she's, you know, a part of, you know, she's sort of ascended now to this strata of influencer, so that when you're scrolling through a feed, you now go, oh, wow, like, this girl's legit, because she's not just taking pictures in front of, you know, the pink wall anymore. She's taking pictures at, like, this resort kind of thing, or this hotel, or in this pool, or in this spa, and, you know, she's using this sort of nice jewelry, and she's nice clothes. Oh, well, I'm a so-and-so person from whatever company, like, she should be wearing our clothes. Like, she kind of was just like, they sort of, it's almost this chicken and egg thing with her, where, like, she didn't really change her lifestyle, and it's quite possible that she would have gotten there eventually, but, like, Nick's process sped it up. With Wiley, what was interesting about his story was, I feel like he was just more of, call it, like, it's like not so much the voice of reason, but just sort of the person who's like, oh yeah, it would probably be cool to, like, to your point, just not work and be able to kind of do this full time. He has his first run-in kind of with an internet troll, and is like, wait, like, okay, hold on, sort of thing. Like, I forgot almost that people can be, dicks online basically. And so like now he kind of got scared and never quite seemed like he sort of recovered from it, but, had sort of a better, got out of his crazy job and whatever. But that's why I was just saying the part with Chris just seemed like, I think you said it well, where it was just like, I just feel like they kind of are just trying to do the, oh, well, if you look like you're doing all these really kind of high profile things, then will that make you famous? Whereas he was kind of continuing to do his own thing. And whereas with Dominique, her continuing to do what she would have been doing anyway, they were able to kind of boost that until she effectively became a quote unquote influencer. Whereas with Chris kind of continuing to do his own thing, they just kept trying to make him something, kind of turn him into something that he didn't want to be. And then they kind of just left it, sort of thing.
Yeah, they definitely, I think it was just like I think halfway through, it just seemed like they were out of ideas.
Yeah.
And he was, I do think it was clear to me he was also resisting the process a little bit. And again, I think it comes down to probably like what they set out to do. They were like, okay, we'll do these photos and we'll do this and we'll do whatever. Let's pick 3 people to go along with the ride, and then probably as they started to get into it, he was like, no, this doesn't feel natural to me, which is fair. But I think it was probably a combination of both lack of creativity, but also his lack of interest in whatever their process was going to be.
Yeah, to the Dominique point, another sort of thing I pulled here, Time magazine writer Judy Berman, her review, she was saying, what would have made for a more worthwhile film is to explain why such vapidity appeals to young people. Fake Famous doesn't pause to explore why the only subject who levels up to free jewelry and gadgets and vacations is Dominique. Could her success have something to do with the gender dynamics of influencer culture, where pretty content creators now occupy the niche supermodels carved out a few generations ago, or the value society places on women's looks, regardless of whether they choose to monetize them? It was interesting because there's I wish I would have kind of read a little bit more into sort of what's going on there, to kind of speak to it a little bit more intelligently than I'm about to. But basically there was sort of a uproar on Twitch, and kind of listeners, some of you may know better than I, but basically what seems to continue to happen is you'll have Twitch kind of be this thing where, all things being equal, content being equal, status being equal, you'll have a female streamer who will basically wear a bikini and get tons more streams, tons more whatever, tons more all this kinds of stuff, money, donations, yada yada, than sort of a male streamer. And then there was kind of this just open, ongoing conversation of, is that fair? Is that right? Whether from a business professional sort of standpoint versus a, call it a moral standpoint or whatever. And it's kind of this ongoing conversation. And the few people who have gotten banned have been people who have gone into sort of more of a like sexual kind of sort of aspect of it. And so like when I was reading Judy's review, it was interesting because I do remember thinking about that. And I think I even kind of spoke about it a little bit on the podcast here, where again, it was kind of like, I actually think Dominique would have just become an influencer. And again, like, I just think the timeline is probably just what sort of Nick kind of changed. And it almost, and some of the other reviews that I had read, they were kind of like, oh, it would have been interesting to take someone perhaps who was like overweight, or like someone who wasn't as like traditionally attractive, or these types of things. But I think almost maybe what Nick didn't even realize, because there was such like a heavy emphasis on, well, if we just fake enough photos and then I buy you enough bots and then I buy you enough comments, my point is really just that person will seem influential, and then kind of like end of thesis kind of thing. And I think that's what a lot of the reviews that I was looking at kind of were like, almost all the reviews I read were like very negative about like sort of this, which again, like I didn't really walk away thinking, oh, like, this is sort of a negative documentary. It was just more that they were really kind of tearing at the fact that this paints all influencers as this fame-thirsty sort of bunch, whereas, as you and I were just talking about earlier, there are definitely like professionals on there, meaning like professional, like people who have like talent that are like showcasing it, whether it's photography or cooking, or people who are actually like doing like exercise videos and all that kind of stuff. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there definitely are people who are just trying to like chase that American Idol dream, where it's just like, if I could just do whatever I need to do, even though that may sort of endanger my own mental health or endanger my own physical sort of health, I'm going to do it because I just need to be famous and I want free things and I want to travel and I want to do whatever. And I just think in Nick kind of with this, it would have been interesting to kind of see, again, the stuff that we already kind of talked about with Chris, but then also maybe like what another version of this might have been.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting with some of those critiques. I did, I don't know. I did sort of appreciate, though, I think that they did dig in a little bit on this idea. And I actually did want to ask you about this because you are someone that I would consider to be very off social media, right? But this concept of like, oh, they just portrayed people as fame hungry and all of that. The reason I would disagree, I think, with some of those reviews is they touched on the fact that we now live in a society. And again, I'm not necessarily saying I'm agreeing with this. I just think this was interesting, in which you need to have a social presence in order to be successful in life. Do you remember this part of the documentary where they basically said, like, in order to get jobs, in order to be considered for employers, in order to have friends, in order, and they had a couple different people that were sort of talking about this concept that, like, you have to be socially well known to make it in life now. And I thought that was fascinating because it was, I think, some younger people that were saying that. But then they also had a couple of experts as well that were sort of echoing similar sentiments. But do you feel that way, that we are now at a place where, having a significant Instagram following or LinkedIn or, just the way that you sort of market yourself, being sort of the indicator of, economic opportunity?
I would say there's definitely a generational, it's not cut off, I'll say it's generational threshold. I do think my generation, my age group and older kind of is able to dance the line of having like one foot kind of in both areas where it's like we're aware, maybe there's some of us that post a little more than the others. I think there's this, and again, kind of we're also sort of the generation that's like, oh, I don't need to say, text you or post or comment or whatever and then face the ramifications if I didn't like your photo or if I didn't do this or if I didn't do that or the other. We're kind of a face-to-face generation that has sort of adopted these tools, but I would agree with you that they're definitely from a little bit, again, kind of a mixture of my generation and then younger, where there is that very much sort of scrutiny of the sort of social sort of media kind of footprint. And I think where it starts to have an impact is it used to be, oh, you're kind of cutting edge if you're on social, like, oh, like you're so creative, you're so whatever. And then there was kind of a neutral sort of aspect of it. It was like, yeah, of course, like, someone's online, blah, blah, blah. And now I would argue kind of probably to what you're getting at is there's kind of this like thing that I'm picking up on where if you don't have a footprint, the assumption is not, oh, that person just would rather be, have in-person sort of conversation, or instead of, posting on Twitter publicly, they've got the group chat and the texting, or instead of doing whatever, they're on things like Discord or blah, blah, blah. I think there's now this assumption like, oh, you must have something to hide, or like, oh, you probably, the reason why I can't find something about you is because you deleted it kind of thing. And that's then when you kind of get into the curated, why I asked you, like, does that diminish knowing that everything that you're seeing, even though you may feel a connection to it, may also be sort of fake to a certain degree? There's been this very big push in the last, 5 or 6 years of, identity politics and people posting things because it's easy posting, oh, I hate this person too, or I hate this policy too, or this is stupid or that's stupid or blah, blah, blah. And then everyone cheers and applause and all this kind of stuff. And the people who disagree get quote unquote sort of canceled. And that used to not really have anything to do with social media. Like social media was it was just you actually thinking about thoughts, having conversations, you actually posting cool photos of your vacation, of your family, of your pets. And I think now it's just gotten so complicated that people probably are now these recruiters who, you know, are using automated tools on LinkedIn and then kind of going, oh, okay, let's do a cursory thing and go to Instagram. Oh, this person hasn't posted in 4 or 5 years. They must have deleted things. Because there's not, they wouldn't be able to tell. Like, there's no real, I think there might be some tools, third-party tools that you can sort of scan for that. But it's like, they probably just think, oh, this person probably is hiding something or is doing whatever. Okay, like, let's move on. And like, no interaction, no conversation with that candidate or whatever. And I don't know where that goes or how far that goes or if that swings back kind of thing, but it will be interesting kind of to see, as everyone's kind of been saying, like, or kind of to a certain degree joking about, like, at some point we'll have a president where you'll be able to scroll all the way back to them being a child. And like, what will that mean? Will that mean that, like, hey, this weird joke that you made when you were 10, you know, this weird video, short video, this Instagram, whatever that will be, then does that impact your attempt to get a job at 40? Does that impact your ability to get a promotion at 50, something that happened decades ago? And that, I think, is just kind of all stuff that no one had to consider, but now may be a part of the equation, even if it's only a minor one.
Yeah, I mean, I think hearing some of those reviews just reminds me of like a pet peeve of mine with reviewers, because I often sometimes feel, especially with documentaries, that people are reviewing like purely the second half of the documentary. So I do think that that is an unfair critique about, you know, just portraying it as fame hungry. I actually did appreciate how much setup I think was done in the beginning of the film. I think it's harder to remember that probably when you get towards the end. But I do think that was very well done. And I think that particular point resonated with me because of the implications that it will have moving forward, right? Like that, to your point, like, and I'd written this down, like, likes equals well-liked equals interesting life equals you're hired equals you can date. You know, like, and those are, you know, getting hired, having a relationship, you know, those are some of the key things that a young person is supposed to be able to do in life. Right. And I think that it's a little bit, you know, frightening, but also fascinating to think that we're moving, you know, even faster down that path, essentially, where as individuals, we will have to sort of continue to, you know, curate our own sort of mini brands in order to be deemed, you know, employable or dateable, right? And I think that to me was just this whole other interesting layer of this outside of, you know, influencing people to buy things or whatever. I wish they would have maybe dug a little bit deeper on this concept because, you know, forget maybe saying, oh, are people on Instagram because they want to go buy something. This concept of, are people on Instagram just because they want to be able to successfully navigate life? That's crazy. You know, that to me is something I think is worth looking at a little bit deeper. And I wish they would have spent more time on that because I do think that's a fascinating concept. And to your point, you know, social media is not everyone's jam, right? So what does that do for folks that, you know, don't actually have something to hide, but just would prefer to not be on Instagram, right? There's a lot of those people out there. But if your only ability to be successful now is going to be based on that, yeah, what is that going to do to us as a society?
I think what will also become dangerous, and I've been in the room when people have made hiring decisions based off of some social stuff where they've kind of said, oh, well, this person has X amount of followers, so like they must be good at social media or they must be good at whatever. And it is one of those things where it's, again, like funny with Nick's point of like, you can kind of just inflate all of that. And then if you understand what gets flagged and what gets tripped and what gets whatever, then you kind of just create this sort of perpetual cycle of, I can almost automate or fake that I'm this person that you're looking for without ever having to talk to me. And you might even then just give me the job very simply because I was able to sort of pretend to be this person. And that's why I think it's like what will be interesting to see, you know, in like a Black Mirror kind of way, where there's that episode of sort of the social score. And if you're not tied into this sort of social currency, then you're just sort of shunned. You're just sort of looked down upon as sort of an outcast and an exile. And I think with some of these the way that a lot of this is sort of being set up, it would not even surprise me then when you then have these people who are making like big decisions. Like they're even kind of now, you probably were getting this, you know, with you obviously being younger than I am, getting, I remember about the era of you meet someone and then they go, cool, what's your number? And then they would go, cool, what's your email address? And then I do remember being at the bar before the pandemic and like hitting it off with a few folks. And then it was like, oh, cool. Are you on Instagram? And I was just like, yeah, but I haven't like posted in like 6 years. And like, I was laughing because the way that they looked at me, like, you can do that kind of thing. Like, it was like, oh, like, what do you mean you haven't posted in like 6 years kind of thing? And it was like one of those things where it's like, yeah, I mean, some people, they've come up in it in such a degree that it is sort of the social security number for like that generation. Like, it's like they can't conceive of a world where, like you just sort of said, where some people we just don't care. Like, it's like, I don't want to take it away. I don't necessarily feel, you know, that the algorithm and the regulations and all that kind of stuff, I think they're very complex sort of issues, but I'm kind of like, yeah, or you can just stop scrolling. And like, that's kind of like what I've done, not for any particular reason, but just sort of like, I just sort of don't care sort of thing. And so it is fascinating to see, kind of to what you were talking about earlier, how much it's going to start creeping into your ability to do anything, to make friends. How many times are you being shut out because of a comment you made on social, because of a outfit you put together, and no one will ever say that to your face because that would be too confrontational. But they'll kind of be like, oh, that person must be the kind of person based on this photo. Okay, don't promote them. Like, that's going to kind of be a weird thing that I think we'll see how deep that may bleed into society.
Well, I mean, but not only that. I mean, we know that right now there are parents that pick their child's name based on the availability of the Instagram handle.
Yeah.
You know, that's just a fact. So it's starting way before we even get to the whole job and dating part of life, right? Your name has been curated specifically because of your parents' ability to secure it for you digitally, right? You know, like, and I think that is really even a crazier thing to think about, is that it's starting from the womb.
Yeah, I mean, there are people who have, this is saying, like, they, you know, they get home from the hospital, or not even, you know, they're sitting there in their parents' arms at the hospital, and it's like post number one. And that's why it's like, it's going to be interesting to see what happens to that generation, because they will literally have this from birth to the grave mark on, you know, like, I don't know if it'll be in our lifetime, but it would not surprise me for people to then in the future to go to funerals, and then someone puts together for the low price of $49.99 a highlight reel that like pulls in your 1 million posts from the time that you were literally born to the time that you were like died. And that's just what people do. No one reads a eulogy anymore. You just go and you sit there and you watch the presentation, and then you take selfies by the picture cardboard cutout that they did, and everyone kind of remembers you and post about you, and then blah, blah, blah. And then like, that's it. And like, there's no tangible anything. It's like, it was an online event. That's what that funeral was.
We should Google that, because I bet that might already exist. And if not, that might be an interesting business idea.
Yeah. But no, it's, yeah, I mean, I liked the documentary. I definitely thought I was going to be bored the entire time, because I wasn't, one of the things I tried to do was just sort of, I didn't watch the trailer before we, chose this one. I kind of just read a little bit of the synopsis, and I was like, fine, kind of see what this does. But I liked the premise of it. I think my only really critique was that I just think that, you know, again, as you articulated, I just think that it would have been interesting to watch them be a little bit more creative to figure out what they could have done with Chris. And then regarding the criticism from some of the professional critics, it felt like they were just truthfully, personally offended that the work that they had put in, however authentic or strategic or just whatever on social, was kind of being called into question. And I think, I wish I could remember which one of these reviews I read. They actually had a interview directly with Nick, and He was like, some of the criticisms are valid about like that they didn't really try to deviate too far from this thing or that thing or the other, but he was like, he still thought that like the premise was still sort of very truthful about how there are still enough people, like if everyone, kind of the stat that you were kind of pointing out, like if all these people have 1 million followers, then what does that actually mean, kind of thing? Like, no, that doesn't really mean that anyone's influential anymore. It's just that everyone has amassed followers either by math or by this or by that. Like, I actually don't follow all the people that you watch me watching on YouTube. I don't follow any of them. I just, like, I've stumbled across them and then the algorithm continues to serve them up to me. I don't actually subscribe to any of their channels. And it's kind of like, I probably should, as a way of like supporting them.
I was just going to say, come on.
But I'm also just kind of like,
part of the creator economy and not give back.
But it's also just one of those
things. That's the value exchange.
Yeah, but it's also just one of those things where it's just like a shrug kind of thing. But again, like, I'm an outlier to that extent. Part of my, to give listeners insight, you know, when most people, when Facebook was dropping and, you know, and it was becoming, there was actually a meme I saw the other day that was laughing about how, you know, you're old when your college had to have a conversation about whether or not they were going to join the EDU thing on Facebook, or you remember like before and all that kind of stuff. I just think that there's like this, what is it? Lost my train of thought there. I just don't think that there's like a real reason for, the way that Nick portrays the landscape, I think, is really good. I think most of the criticism of the way that he has sort of portrayed it is valid, but I think it's also just because these platforms are so vast. And I think the one very important point that he makes is that no one is paying that close attention, because if everyone did, it might break everything. And that I actually do think is really true, where it's like the amount of people who might have bought bots, the amount of people who might have bought comments to just kickstart their account kind of thing. Because I think one of the reviews was like, I think Dominique, I meant to look before the podcast, I think is like at like almost 350,000. She might have like more by now type of thing. When she started with like 1,100, and people who haven't seen the documentary and are just living kind of in their own life sort of thing, and maybe they're responsible for influencer outreach. They discover Dominique and they're like, oh, hey, here's this woman who has more than 250,000. Let's like send her free jewelry and people should do an unboxing and blah, blah, blah. And like that cycle is just fascinating. And I think that's something that like everyone needs to like consider. Does something need to be done about it? I don't know. But like, it's something that like, I think everyone should kind of like think through when they start making actual heavy decisions based on what someone has posted or what their social media followings look like.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think the challenge of a documentary like this as well is just that there's so many different aspects to this storytelling, right? And I think, one of the experts had said, it's not possible to separate the negatives of influencer culture from the tech platforms, right? That could be a whole other documentary in and of itself, right? Because I think that I agree with you, but I also think that's another component as well that we need to be aware of, is like influencer culture does exist because of these platforms, right? So that's something that I think needs to be looked at as well, because this ultimately, yes, it's beneficial for the bot industry. It's beneficial for people trying to hawk things, but it's most beneficial to the people that created these services in the first place, right? And everything is sort of built up in a way to continue to foster this environment because it is most lucrative for Facebook, for Instagram, for all of this to kind of continue on, right? So I think from my perspective, it's like that will be what we actually have to look at, I think, at a much larger level. And obviously, we know our government is starting to look into these things, and we're going to see privacy law continue to evolve in this country and change, and potentially even some of these companies getting broken up. But yeah, I mean, I think this is a new and fast growing economy that has been created to do exactly what it's doing, and it's doing it very well. And it's going to take much larger forces at this point, to shut it down, because it's become so ingrained in our psychology and our daily behavior and the way that we raise our kids and live our lives. And I think that, I agree. I thought it was a good documentary. I think that some of those critiques are probably a little bit harsh. And I also think that in a lot of ways, I would say it's a little bit of like required watching. There's definitely some younger people I can think of that I would like to see this, and, to go back kind of to the beginning about, just some of the enlightenment that I felt coming out of it, I think is just definitely, not just the time consuming part of it, but I think a lot of what sort of, Wiley was wrestling with and Chris was wrestling with a little bit is that, if you yourself feel like an authentic person, being on Instagram can make you feel the opposite, right? And I think it's a trap that I think is dangerous for a lot of people. And I go back and forth because, for me personally, I'm a creative person. So it's really fun sometimes to feel like I'm curating something or, kind of putting my vision out into the world. But at the same time, it's also like, it is really time consuming. It is really distracting. I think that in the last kind of several years, I've tried to be a lot more present sometimes, even in some of these experiences that I know other people are going out and literally videoing and taking photos. And, the whole thing is kind of the documentation of it. And I think that that's the part that makes me kind of sad. I think that a lot of young people being wrapped up into this is like losing that sort of, living in the moment for the moment, versus living to document it, so we'll see. I don't know. I don't know where influencer culture will go from here. But I think that there's still a lot of things that we need to examine.
Yeah. One of the things, a podcast many moons ago, that I did with a friend of mine, and we had talked about the eternal debate of everyone at the time who was obsessed with taking pictures of their dinner and like their coffees and their snacks and all this kinds of stuff. And I think was the only one in the room that I was just like, I would rather not. And the joke was like, oh, well then like, how are you going to do this and this? And I was like, cause I was there, like, I remember it. Like that's why it's special sort of thing. And I think the general consensus in the room was a couple of generations, kind of like a few folks who were like 6 or 7 years younger than I was. And I think the general consensus in the room was like, take the picture and then post it later. I think it was kind of this thing where like people kind of sort of like what you were just saying, where it was like there was a obsession to document at the cost of just experiencing the event, which was sort of counterintuitive because if you do get invited on this vacation, you almost don't get to enjoy it because you're then technically working the entire time. It's like, yes, you're in the spa, but then you're kind of thinking about, okay, take this picture. Unless perhaps you are one of those people who can have like a photographer or a crew follow you around. But yeah, it's kind of I think all of it's going to be just very interesting to kind of see how it pans out. But
well, reminds me of another one of my favorite scenes that I think illustrates your point, and that is towards the end on the influencer trip, where they're on the party bus, and I think just about every woman on the bus is asleep. That was just hysterical to me, to see 30 women stacked on top of each other, completely conked out, but yet there's still the stripper pole, there's still the red lights flashing on their faces. To me, that probably did the best job of encompassing just how unglamorous so much of it is, right? They are not having the time of their lives. They're asleep with strobe lights flashing in their face.
Any final thoughts on Fake Famous? I think we pretty much touched upon almost every current issue that is plaguing the influencer culture and all the things that they are dealing with.
No, I mean, I definitely, again, I would recommend that people check it out. I think whether you are on Instagram or not on Instagram, I think everyone will learn something from this. I do think there's at least a couple of different nuggets that probably will surprise people or give, you just a different perspective maybe on the work and the time and the energy that goes into this. I do just want to say I appreciated the sort of wrapper of the film in front of the pink wall and the opera music. I thought was a nice touch, and just kind of hysterical, just the time lapse of it starting with that scene and then ending with that scene, but everyone in masks. So just, we'll have to go visit that pink wall at some point.
Yeah, I agree. I'd also would recommend this. I think unlike, I don't know, I'm definitely not going to remember what that was called, but that documentary that was getting a lot of attention about the algorithm that sort of came out. I felt like that documentary was a little too, almost like, I don't want to say it didn't really have anything to say. It just didn't really leave me with anything to think about. Like, it was kind of one of those things where it was sort of a, it just kind of, it felt forgettable. Whereas I completely agree with you and why I would recommend this, because it feels like it actually gives a little bit more insight. It's definitely by no means like the definitive, this is the only thing that you should consume. I would say that this is a great introduction to what goes on behind the scenes with influencers, and kind of will leave you with enough to think about of, you know, you could watch this documentary, start scrolling on Instagram, and then you'll kind of start wondering about the seams and wondering, oh, is that picture real or is it not real? And then if it's not real, how does that affect everything from, you know, body image to, is this attainable? Like you were saying much earlier about sort of like, you wouldn't be able to do this on your income. Those places are this. And like, it definitely opens it up quite a bit. And then, you know, if you wanted to kind of keep going down the influencer rabbit hole, there's plenty of sort of other things to sort of consume, but I actually thought it was a great intro piece, just to sort of that whole culture and kind of like where it could go for one reason or another.
For sure. I think the other one you're talking about is The Social Dilemma, right? Yeah. People can check that out too, but maybe be dissatisfied.
And with that, ladies and gentlemen, fellow Feathers and Arms, that is episode 1. As we mentioned up top, if you enjoyed what you heard, help us keep it going by supporting us at patreon.com/Pandora's Quack and becoming a Patreon of one of our tiers starting as low as $1. Otherwise, feel free to share, rate, and review us on the podcasting service of your choice, and stick around for Pandora's Quack's other upcoming shows. Thank you to Nicole. Thank you to the listeners. This podcast was produced by Pandora's Quack. She's Nicole, and you can follow her. Would you like to be followed, Nicole, despite everything that you have said? Would you like to remain only for the astute Googlers, or would you like them to know where to find you?
Oh, no. I mean, come on. Ain't no shame in the game. Please follow me at Marie Coley on Instagram.
And I'm Brandon Jones, and you can follow me at Lamar Diablo. That's one word on Twitter. I think I posted the last time 3 years ago. So if I get enough followers, maybe I'll start tweeting again. And, of course, these are the rabbit holes that quack. Good night.